I want to begin by asking you a couple of questions before we internationalize the conversation in terms of the subject and the focus. There are some interesting times at the moment within the State of Israel, as ever they are. I'd like your overview of those topics, but are you comfortable with me expressing that you're an individual who identifies with the left on the political spectrum in the State of Israel, or do you take a different description? How would you describe your political positioning, Arthur?
It's a good question because definitions are dangerous these days, and there are so many. I am definitely what one would call a center leftist. There are two things I believe in, and those things put me where I just said. One, I believe in a fairer way of distribution of wealth in the country. Definitely capitalism, but I think that we need to look a little bit more for our poor, for those that are unlucky, and to make sure that they catch up. And the second is I strongly support a solution on the Palestinian front with the Palestinians in a way which is definitely not a one-state solution, or on the other hand, annexation without rights, meaning the third option is some kind of compromise. And if that puts me in the center left, I am center left.
So I really appreciate you saying that and being so open and honest with us and qualifying it and really defining where you are politically. And I want to begin by asking you about the coalition in the State of Israel, because the coalition has many, many features within it. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu is still at the helm of it, joined by Benny Gantz, Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister. But you also do have Labour in there with Amir Peretz, and what I'd like to know is, can this conglomeration, can this odd set of bedfellows actually yet prove themselves as being able to form and forge and govern effectively? Or is this a coalition that really is doomed to fail, given the composition of it and its current situation? It doesn't seem to be succeeding now. Give us a quick overview of that.
In theory, it could have worked. We have had in the past national unity governments that operated really in a very effective way, and even saved us from economic disasters and regional complex situations. We remember Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir working together, and others. So, and who could be further away than those two? Mm-hmm. Actually, you know, Gantz, Ashkenazi, and their party is a centrist party. It is not so far away from the Likud. So ideologically, there is no reason why it couldn't work. It cannot work. The reality is that it doesn't. And I see very little hope that it can change. We are very quickly moving towards a decision. Probably it's not certain, but probably moving to a decision next week to have the fourth election in just over a year, which is, if you ask me, it's pathetic. We should be a stable democracy. That we pride ourselves on being a stable democracy in the Middle East. We are everything but stable. And so I don't see right now how this coalition can work together. The lack of trust between the different partners is so deep, and the challenges are so huge that even though personally I think that what Israel needs least is new elections, maybe if there is a decision, if the new elections do happen and there will be a winner, no matter who, that can create a stable government, hopefully, that can change things. The problem is that we may end up in the same situation exactly.
So with that having been said, in the coalition that there is, and I want to now come to your wheelhouse, we have a foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi. And one of the things that's gone on for the years of Bibi Netanyahu's premiership as the prime minister of the States of Israel has been an idea, a notion that he has deliberately gutted the foreign ministry, that he's decided that on foreign affairs he wants to take much more of a realpolitik approach. He wants to deploy the Mossad, the intelligence, the defense sector, and that he's really tried deliberately, as I said, to downgrade the effectiveness and the reach of the foreign ministry. And now here you have at the helm a fellow from the very sectors that Netanyahu preferred to deploy, on occasions, not always, but on occasions. You have Gabi Ashkenazi, a former chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces. Do you think that Gabi Ashkenazi can breathe new oxygen into the foreign ministry? And do you think that he has the credentials and the gravitas and the leadership, frankly, to now lead Israel's diplomatic corps?
First of all, if this government will not last long, then he will not have the chance of creating a change within the ministry. But from my understanding, and I am, as you can imagine, I am in touch with many colleagues, former colleagues in the ministry. He came in after studying thoroughly the material, both when it comes to Israel's challenges and opportunities regionally and internationally, but also all the problems that you described so well, I don't want to repeat them, created by the deliberate weakening of the ministry by Benjamin Netanyahu. And he came in with clear determination to bring back the ministry to the place where a foreign ministry or a State Department in American terms should be. And he has done quite a lot already, but create real change, you need a much longer time, and we will see if he'll have it.
You think the potential is there for the foreign ministry to be resurrected?
It will take time. It will necessitate returning funds which were taken away from the ministry and left it crippled for a long time. So we need to make sure that the ministry stands on its own feet when it comes to manpower, professionalism, budget, but also to return to be a member at the decision-making process. We say it, there is the round table where everybody sits. For too long, the ministry was either not sitting around the table or was sitting there silenced. So it is now heard again. Minister Ashkenazi makes sure that it is heard again. It is around the table, but that is important, but not enough. More needs to be done.
So let's talk now about the subject at hand that we said we would discuss, which is Israel's geostrategic positioning. We had enormous news of this announcement to normalize ties between Israel and the U.A.E. Now, I'd like to start with a very basic question. This phrase, the U.A.E. announces the normalization of ties with the State of Israel, whomever you wish to attribute that to. Just pass out for our listeners what they should take from this phrase, normalization of ties, as opposed to a peace deal or a peace treaty.
Yeah, I think that's a short answer. We were not at war. Therefore, if the two countries were not at war, there is no need for peace. But we were definitely not in relations which are normal, as should be between two potentially friendly countries. So that is why the terminology is normalization. and not peace. We never fought each other, so we don't need to make peace. But we definitely need to normalize relations. Hopefully, things are still in the working, but hopefully with full embassies operating in the two capitals, or I'm sure it will not be in Jerusalem, unfortunately, but they will have it in Tel Aviv or something, but with embassies, with trade, with tourism, with investment, with all that entails in relations between two friendly countries, which is something of importance when it is between Israel and a significant, rich, influential Arab country.
And so that normalization of ties was something that seemed to have been agreed about, or was agreed upon, to the total exclusion of the engagement of Gabi Ashkenazi or the foreign ministry. What will their role be now, Arthur? Put that into context for us, moving forward, assuming the government holds, of course.
Yeah, well, let's assume. I won't gamble on that, but let's assume that. In the end, after the declaration, after the ceremony, although the ceremony is yet to come, a lot of details need to be worked out and a lot of maintenance in those relations. Those details and the maintenance of those relations will not be conducted, with all due respect, by Benjamin Netanyahu individually. You have to have a structure, a network of professionals working on it, and that is going to be led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as it is in international relations, and I'm sure with the Defense Ministry when it comes to issues relating to that ministry and other ministries as well. But the coordination in the end and the nitty-gritty of the details will be put mainly, not solely, but mainly by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the role for the future, in the future for the ministry is clear. But you know, that is in theory. In Israel, everything is possible, like the Prime Minister keeping this whole story secret from the Foreign Minister and the Defense Minister, who is also the alternate Prime Minister, who are also two former chiefs of staff who had been exposed to every secret in the country. So everything is possible in this country. I can't hear you, Benjamin.
I'd like you, please, if you would, to just explain to everybody, let's start there in that region. What are the implications of the normalization of ties for the State of Israel? And can you please tie it into the issue, of course, of Iran? Let's start with Iran. I'm going to ask you about the Israel-Palestinian conflict later on in our conversation, if I may.
I have to say, to start by saying that contacts between Israel and Gulf states are not new. Actually, already after the Madrid conference and later the Oslo process, things started to open up in quite a number of Arab states, both in the Gulf and North Africa. So, for example, after Oslo, Morocco, that maintained contacts with Israel even earlier, made those contacts public. To this day, any Israeli can travel freely to Morocco, even though we don't have diplomatic relations, with Israeli passports. We had a diplomatic office in Tunisia. We had diplomatic offices in Abu Dhabi, in Qatar. So these are not new. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, some of those relations either ceased altogether or, like with Tunisia, or went back to being under the table. And but things are not, you know, like from darkness to light in a sudden. That's number one. Nonetheless, normalizing relations, having embassies, assuming that that will be concluded, because so far it is still in the working now. The details are still in the working. Direct flights, tourism. We have had some trade before, but I'm sure the trade and investment will increase because it is so much easier when things are open.
Right.
And this is with a country that is on the Gulf. On the other side of the Gulf is Iran. There is no question that the motivation, to a very large extent, is, the enemy of your of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
That has to be, to a very large extent, the motivation. It is understandable. We are extremely concerned by the policy and the efforts of the Iranians that only today exposed 2 new long-range missiles that they developed. The Gulf states are extremely concerned as well, for good reason. And if this is what strategically brings us together, it is important for both of us.
Let me ask you another question about that, which is really in your area of expertise. We had a brilliant article, in my view, it's a brilliant article put forward by one of our adjuncts. Ladies and gentlemen on the line, I'd encourage you to read this article. It's by Zachary Shapiro. And Zachary wrote the following, Arthur. I'd like to ask you to comment on it. His article is titled, "Israel Must Seize Its Moment in Abu Dhabi." And there he writes, among other things, the Israeli government should choose its first envoy to Abu Dhabi carefully and strategically. And Netanyahu should vet candidates more cautiously than he has in the past. And he goes on to talk about some of the pitfalls with Danny Dayan. You'll remember the debacle that took place with Brazil. And ultimately, Danny Dayan came and was consul general in New York. And he then goes on to say that on other occasions, Netanyahu has used diplomatic appointments to exile potential political foes like Danny Danon. Now, here's Zach's suggestion. He says, this time, Netanyahu should resist the urge to politicize the appointment. He should select an ambassador who can speak to the Emirati people articulately, an Arab-Israeli official, and he nominates 2 individuals. One is George Deek, Israel's ambassador to Azerbaijan, who has been named Israel's best diplomat in some circles, and also Ishmael Khaldi, who in July became Israel's ambassador to Eritrea. What do you think about the importance of the ambassadorial positioning, if you could talk about that, and how do you feel about getting the nominees from the background that Zach's advocating?
First of all, I totally agree that the nomination of our first ambassador to the United Arab Emirates should be very carefully considered, not to commit mistakes that we have done in the past. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned just a few, I can mention a few more. But I wouldn't go that in the direction of suggesting that the first ambassador should be actually an Israeli Arab. It can be. I have, of course, no objection, but I don't think that that should be the number one consideration. It should be a professional diplomat, an experienced diplomat who knows the region. And we have many diplomats in the ministry who know the region because, as I told you before, they served already in the region. They lived there for years. We are not starting from scratch. And I would definitely try, if I had been the one giving my opinion to the Prime Minister, I would say, don't choose anybody from the Mossad or the Shabak. Don't choose anybody from those circles that you are so used to working together and surround yourself with. Choose a professional diplomat or somebody even from the academia who has been acquainted deeply with the region, understands it, and will be well accepted by the people in the United Arab Emirates.
Let's move now away from that. I want to talk a little bit about Israel's relationship with China, if I may. And one of the things that was reported is that Israel and the United States are close to signing a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, that would commit Israel to not using Chinese equipment in building its 5G networks, a US government source said over the weekend. And it then goes on to explain that Israel is close to joining the US State Department's Clean Network that was announced earlier this month. Now, Israel has obviously this issue of the Haifa port, which I'd like you to perhaps explain, and the Chinese involvement, the Haifa port and the Chinese involvement there. I'd like you to explain that. How does Israel extricate itself from that complication while continuing to bind itself ever closer to the United States of America? And do you think Israel can effectively manage, I wouldn't say this conflict of interest, but these very different strategic alliances or cooperations that they have?
It is, by the way, again, it will not be the first time that we are in the middle of major geopolitical games by two powers, and we, the small Israel, have to make decisions. And for me, if we are forced to make a decision, it is clear in which direction we have to take those decisions. Years ago, Israel signed a contract to sell Falcon intelligence airplane to China. The United States objected, and we had to stop that deal, and we paid the price vis-a-vis China, both in terms of dollars and diplomatic stature. But if we had to make a choice, it was clear that in the end, we will take the side of the United States if it is concerned about anything, really concerned with justification about something that we do. China is not a force to ignore, not politically, not economically, and not strategically, not in any other term. It is a growing power. It is a huge market. Israel invests a lot in developing its trade with China, its export, encouraging Chinese investment in Israel. This is important. If the United States has trade and investment with China, of course, Israel, the little Israel, wants it too. On the other hand, the United States is concerned about increased involvement of Chinese companies in building infrastructure. You mentioned the Haifa port, but there is the Tel Aviv metro, which is being built, and there are other significant infrastructure projects built either by or financed by China. These are, and then you talked about the fifth generation. So I think that Israel will have to understand that is, and now I'm not an active diplomat, I can say more clearly, Israel will have to listen very carefully to what the American, to them, and act on American concerns, not if they are reasonable. And to the Chinese, we can always say, look, in every international forum, we get the backing, full backing of the United States. In every international forum, you, China, vote against us. In the end, this is something that we have to take into consideration.
So let's move again. You made mention. Actually, I'm going to ask you a question that I hadn't thought about because you spoke about the Falcons. Let's talk about the U.A.E. deal. Let's go back a moment, and then I'll spring forward to another part of the world. So a lot of the controversy surrounding the U.A.E. deal, in addition to the euphoria and the celebration, has been this idea of the sale of F-35s. Where do you see that going, Arthur? What are the implications there? It's obvious and clear that to everybody, or I believe it to be obvious and clear to everybody, that military cooperation, security cooperation, the supply of weaponry and capabilities is all part of this. What are the implications of the F-35, and do you think that it's correct that that is one of the key objectives that the U.A.E. has in the defense sector as a result of normalizing ties?
It is definitely...
Also, if I may, also, can Israel stop it?
Yeah. After the first few days of, no, there wasn't a euphoria and there were no celebrations, you know, it is not Egypt. It is not the first peace treaty that was signed between Israel and an enemy. After the signing of the peace treaty with Egypt, there was celebration and euphoria. Let's not exaggerate right now. It is important, however. And it is clear what the U.A.E. is getting or expecting to get. It is getting from Israel, and probably it seems now also from the United States, strategic assets. And the question is, what is Israel getting and what is Israel paying? You can ask, there's a payment issue also regarding the U.A.E. It is paying by heightened tension with Iran. And that is something that they have to take into consideration. They are paying by the Palestinians turning against them. That is payment. So they are getting and paying, and so are we. The F-35 is not an airplane. It is a strategic platform of unbelievable capability. I just heard yesterday an interview with a reserve pilot of the Israeli Air Force, senior pilot of the Israeli Air Force, who says, I am a pilot and I cannot go into the quarters of where the F-35 is because it is so secret, and I am a pilot. I'm afraid that if this is part of the deal, then it is potentially a dramatic change in Israel's strategic position in the region. Israel has to have, because, you know, things can change. Right now, the leadership of the U.A.E. is friendly. I hope it will continue to be for generations, but things can change. And to have suddenly F-35 potentially turning against us, that is a problem. But the bigger problem is that if the U.A.E. is getting F-35, the Saudis will want it. And other countries, and Donald Trump will, as he said last night, will say, and they are willing to pay. And so if it is all money, then there is every reason to be concerned. Can Israel stop it? Look, in the Congress, a resolution was passed years ago, which is called the QME, the Qualitative Military Edge, which is promised by Congress to Israel. The United States Congress is committed to maintaining Israel's qualitative edge in the region. But am I certain that if this deal will go to the Senate, with all the pressures of the military industry, defense industry, and so on, that they will say, no, we are not approving it because of this resolution? I hope so, I'm not sure.
So let's talk about another country that can't be ignored, which is Russia. And I'd like you to please assess Israel's relationship with Russia, not only in a vacuum, but also its presence there in Syria, its relationship with Iran, and also where do you see Turkey and Russia coming into the fold with regard to the state of Israel diplomatically and in terms of security at this time? Now, I know it's a very large question, but I don't think now, and please correct me if you think I'm mistaken, I don't think that you can assess Israel's geostrategic position without talking a little bit about what's going on over there in Turkey and how it relates to our neighbors and also how it relates to a countervailing presence in the Arab world, Sunni, Shia, and so forth. Can you explain that as you see it?
Just to say that the story of Russia and of Turkey are two different stories. It is true that you put them together, I imagine, because of both of them being involved quite deeply in Syria and in Libya. So these are two places where they are involved in, by the way, in Libya, not necessarily on the same side. So Russia is a major power. And it has been a major power in the Middle East until the Soviet Union, until the Soviet Union collapsed. And Russia seized the opportunity of the civil war in Syria to return. And it returned in a big way. So by saving President Assad, the assets that it received are of strategic importance. A major Air Force base and a major naval base. And these assets are now theirs. And I'm sure that the Sixth Fleet of the US Navy in the Mediterranean has to take that into consideration. That's the goal of Russia. Turkey is a different story because Erdogan slowly, but surely created a dramatic change in Turkey in this country, which was mostly secular, Western, a key member, still is a key member, but a distant key member of NATO, without really aspirations of becoming once again the Ottoman Empire as it used to be for hundreds of years. And Erdogan seems to have that kind of megalomaniac aspirations once again. Unfortunately, as part of his ideology, and he belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood, that is his ideological inclination.
Right.
And that brings him to become quite hostile towards Israel. I'm using British understatement. Not starting war, but very hostile. It supports Hamas. It came out against the U.A.E. agreement last week. And I can give example after example after example. It is gaining power, influence, but there is also great increased concern by leading Arab countries because of that. Egypt, for one, and others. Turkey is also very hostile when it comes to marking the naval borders for the search of natural gas, which the Eastern Mediterranean seems to be quite rich with. So it is now in conflict with Greece. It is in conflict with Cyprus. It is in conflict with Egypt. It has, just a few years ago, Erdogan came out with its foreign regional policy. And the regional policy that he declared is zero conflict with any of our neighbors. And from zero conflict, it seems that he is looking for every conflict that he can find. It is important. Turkey is an important country. We have every reason to maintain as good relations as we can with Turkey, but for the foreseeable future, it will not go back to where we were.
It's also a paradigmatic example, Arthur, of what you mentioned before in your response about the F-35 in Saudi Arabia. Things can change, right? Israel had very positive. Pardon
absolutely.
me?
And let me just add, because you mentioned it and it is so important. Turkey was this far from acquiring F-35, just I think 2 or 3 years ago. This far. But it committed a mistake and it purchased the SS-400 from Russia, ground-to-air, so very sophisticated ground-to-air missiles rather than American system. And so Donald Trump decided to punish them and to stop the deal of selling F-35 to Turkey. Now, just imagine that it would have been otherwise.
There's an article that says that, well, we know it to be the case. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Wednesday that he would be going to the United Nations in order to begin the process of triggering snapback sanctions on Iran, setting up a likely clash with other members of the United Nations Security Council. Now, to give everybody a bit of context, this follows what is described as an embarrassing loss Friday in the Security Council trying to extend an arms embargo on Tehran that expires in October. So what would you say is the probability of snapback sanctions coming? What do you think are the implications of the rebuffing of the desire to reimpose sanctions related to the Iran nuclear deal? And where is Israel on the issue of Iran? And if you can tie it to its relationship with the United States, strategic relationship, I'd be very grateful.
When it comes to Iran, I think it is fair to say that Israel and the United States are exactly on the same level. The concerns are the same. The strategic steps needed to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons seem to be shared by both Israel and the United States. And of course, it is unfortunate, I have to say not unexpected, that the United States, in that sense Israel too, lost the battle, so to say, in the United Nations to extend the sanctions. It was expected. I am, being now retired for a few years, I'm not sure I know if there is a technical tool through which those sanctions can be returned. And it would be nice, to have such a technicality, a closure somewhere. I don't know of its existence. Therefore, I think that it is more a declaration than a practical step. The chances of bringing back the sanctions by the United Nations right now seem to me quite low, if not zero. However, the United States has many other ways of making sure that the world, so to say, is not jumping now, once the official sanctions of the United Nations are over, to have a free bargain, a bazaar, a Turkish bazaar, so to say, selling everything they can to Iran. First of all, Iran, of course, doesn't have so much money right now, but it has, and it will have even more once the prices of oil will go up more. So the United States has within its power many tools to ensure that no European or even Russian and Chinese companies will now jump into the water and sell everything to Iran. That is my reading of it.
We just saw the official announcement of Joe Biden. Everybody knew it, of course, but he is the official candidate for the presidency of the Democratic Party. There are a couple of things. There's been an issue about anti-Semitism within the Democratic Party for some time. People are aware of it. I don't want you just to limit yourself to identifying areas that are thorny within the Democratic Party. I'd like you to talk about the Republican Party as well, Arthur, if you see those issues. I invite you to make us aware of those and to expound upon those. But one of the areas that was indicative of a pending issue, a coming problem, perhaps even a coming storm, is that Joe Biden personally intervened to keep the word occupation out of the official Democratic platform. That's in accordance to a report at the time. Now, it's said that prior to Biden's intervention, progressives in the party had secured agreements to include the word for the first time in the Democratic platform. The Democratic platform, however, also condemned the boycott Israel movement. Now, why do I mention this? Because there has been, and you and I have spoken about this offline several times, there has been this growing sense of an anti-Semitic presence there within the party. And people talk about that and they focus upon that. But here we have the nominee proactively inserting himself to prevent language that would be increasingly adversarial towards the state of Israel. So that's a positive sign that I see. There's also the other side of it, which is he might be able to stymie that at this moment, but it seems that it's almost inexorable at this stage in some people's minds. Can you assess the position of Joe Biden as the nominee? And can you assess the position of the Democratic Party with regard to the state of Israel, please?
First of all, let me just, for the record, say that it is not the first time and not the last that in both parties, before the convention, there are all kinds of versions and texts being exchanged where pro-Palestinian members in either party try to include language favoring them, and this is the political game. This is the final wording is in the end what counts. And in the past we had similar attempts to include occupation and this and that, and this would not be the first time. But to the larger picture, yeah, I think that there are segments within the Democratic Party which are more distanced from Israel than we saw in the past. Of course, that doesn't include all of the Democratic Party, but in the last few years particularly, we saw trends, language, and elected officials, which bring reason to that are quite hostile. Let's say it, to Israel and Israel's positions. When it comes to the presidential candidate, Biden and his deputy, I have to say that in both of them are very positive, with a very positive record towards Israel. Both in voting, in statements, during visits, during speeches at AIPAC. We have the number one and the number two with great record, and they are both committed to Israel's well-being, security, against, as you said, boycotting Israel, against imposing a settlement on Israel. And in that sense, I think that there is no reason to be concerned.
What do you think about the relationship between, still on the same section, the relationship between American patriotic Zionist Jews and the states of Israel? And there is a great deal of tension at the moment, and I'm hearing it from people. Those who traditionally vote Democrat are concerned about the growing anti-Semitism they see in the party. Those who vote Republican traditionally are concerned about the implications of the president and his policies domestically in the United States of America. And this is bringing attention amongst some. Now, I want to emphasize the first loyalty of these American Zionist Jewish voters is to the United States of America. But the issue about which I'm speaking, namely Israel's relationship with the United States, is something that they consider as in America's interests. And they do express this profound tension and torment inwardly on either side of the aisle. What would be your words to the American voter from the Jewish community?
It's a huge issue. I would love to do another webinar one day on this specific issue of Israel diaspora and Israel-American Jewish relations. It is a matter that I'm following very closely, and it is dear to me. First of all, let me say that in the same way that there are concerns about certain segments within the Democratic Party when it comes to their policy attitude towards Israel, there are certain segments within the American right which, as you know, have a very problematic position regarding Israel, but even more so regarding Jews. So, extremes on both sides exist. but I don't want to talk about the extremes. I want to talk about the mainstream on both sides, because for me, that is the main issue. That is the point number one. The second issue is, and again, American Jews vote against in the American elections based on their views regarding their life in America. That is their number one consideration. But for many, the American policy towards Israel is a significant issue as well. And what concerns me to a larger extent for a number of years, and I don't see that diminishing, on the contrary, I see that as the rifts within the Israeli society deepen, so do the differences between the certain groups in America deepen. I am concerned because even if they don't say that, somebody like me, who defined himself in the beginning of this discussion as a center-left, I walk in the streets of Jerusalem, and had people I walk by would know that I did not vote for Bibi, they would call me a traitor. I know of American Jews who look at somebody who does not support Bibi or a right-wing government, who think that is on the verge of treason, but if not, definitely not patriotic. I am not patriotic enough. Now, let me say that for 35 years, I served the Israeli government, every government, right, left, and center, during those years, as a diplomat, with full commitment to serve my country, not any specific leader, to serve my country. And before that, I was an officer in the IDF. And I educated my children to serve their country. Both of them served as combat soldiers in the army. And they still today do reserve duty in their tank units in the army. And I pay taxes, and I care about this country like, whenever I land, now there are no flights because of the COVID, but whenever I come back from a flight from abroad, and I land at the Ben Gurion airport, I swallow, with excitement, because I come back to Israel. And the language used, both in Israel, but both among some, or the attitude towards those who are not supporters of Bibi or the Israeli right coalition, is a major concern. I told you, we spoke a few days ago, that now as a sidekick, I'm doing the course to become a tour guide. So I do it for the fun of it, and I want to study. But I just, last week or two, we went on tour and to see the Siur Beit Rishon and Siur Beit Sheni, the second temple and the first temple ruins. And I read about the fall of the second temple. And we all Jews talk about, the second temple fell because of Sinat Chinam, because inner hate between the Jews. But I now know the details. They killed each other. The Romans were circling Jerusalem, and the Jews between killed each other. They burned the stocks of food, so they were left without food during the siege. And this was done Jews by Jews, Jews to Jews. We have to stop this language. We have to stop this disregard to opinions of others, disrespect to opinions of others. If there is one thing that I cannot forgive leadership in Israel, is the language of division. Division is not the way to win elections. You can win elections, unfortunately, by division. But this is not the right way, because you can bring the whole house down. With that, I'm done.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Arthur. I do know that you're deeply impassioned by this subject, and I do know that you've given the best of yourself across a storied career in service of the State of Israel. And absolutely, we'd be honored to have you back to do that webinar, and maybe you would publish something for us as well. I only have a couple of minutes before I said I would open it up to the audience, and I'm stepping into a large subject here. So if I could ask you to give a concise, succinct answer, just out of deference to our listeners. The U.A.E. normalization of ties with the State of Israel is wonderful. It has not remedied, it's possibly worsened the situation between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. What is the situation there? What are the next steps from Mahmoud Abbas, from Hamas? What should Israel be doing next in order to bring about the
I don't think that the U.A.E. deal worsened the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I think it's a reflection of their weakness. It didn't, the Palestinians have committed so many mistakes along the years, and they are so isolated, and they are so, insignificant, so to say, in the power game of the region, of course, globally as well, that, that the fact is that the U.A.E. signing or not signing this agreement with Israel, who asked them at all? And that is the reflection of their weakness. It doesn't mean that Israel did not pay a price for this U.A.E. deal or normalization. The fact that the first statement by the U.A.E. was that normalization was in return for Israel dropping off the table the annexation is a price to pay. It is interesting, by the way, we talk about perceptions. There was a poll a few days ago testing what the Israeli public thinks about the U.A.E. deal. And with this, I will end the Palestinian issue because it's connected. I think that the Israeli public is quite clever. 63% see in this deal an achievement of Benjamin Netanyahu. So he gets the credit for reaching this normalization. 62% of the Israeli public see this agreement, say that by taking off the annexation, Netanyahu broke a direct promise he made before the elections and after the elections. So they say it's an achievement, but he broke the promise. And 77% of the Israeli public prefer this agreement over annexation. So this doesn't surprise me. Most of the Israeli public, in reality, don't see any benefit from the annexation. Actually, I don't happen to agree, but most Israelis think that the status quo is good enough and we can continue like this forever. I don't think we can continue like this forever, but the status quo right now seems to be stable with hiccups, particularly vis-a-vis the Hamas, but the Hamas has nothing to do with anything because it's a terror organization.
I know there's so much more that you could say. I will just say that I also belong to that 30% of Israelis who is in favor of the application of sovereignty in the Jordan Valley for various reasons, and I'm published on that subject. But as the Institute prides itself in doing, we've got a range of views about that particular topic. I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience. Danny in Texas. Please open up the audio of Danny in Texas. And Danny, we'd love to get your question for Ambassador Koll.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you hear me.
We hear you.
I cannot see you, but I hear you.
I'm a very concerned Israeli who's living in the States now for the last 30 years. I'm very honored to listen to your opinions here, and you're very sincere and very thoughtful. I thought that I would like to ask you one major question, which appears to me quite a breakthrough with this unique agreements with the U.A.E. I believe that this is the first opening situations which we've never really, even though we tried in the past, It's going to open up potential relationships with major other countries, major influential Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Qatar, Oman, and the rest of them. And I believe that this could be a major influence on the Palestinians, potentially to change their way of thinking and probably to reach the goal of what we would like to reach is a final solution in the Middle East. I would like to hear your opinion on
that. Firstly, let me say that I fully agree that there is hope, and potentially there is a chance that the U.A.E. agreement will be followed by others. Who can those be? There are a number of candidates. Saudi Arabia already clarified a few days ago it is not going to be the next one, because it stated that it continues to support its own initiative for regional peace, and there is not going to be a normalization before an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So that is of the, but on the other hand, they did not criticize, of course, the agreement between us and the U.A.E. But there is Qatar, there is Oman. Qatar is a complicated story because the majority of the population in Qatar, if you don't know, I remind us all, are Shiites. And there is a large segment of the population in Qatar that is quite pro-Iranian, so they are in a sensitive situation. Morocco, maybe, but no matter what, there is hope that there is going to be some kind of continuation, and it is a positive step. Will it have an effect on the Palestinians to move forward? I think that the Palestinians right now are in a deadlock. Personally, I don't think that Abu Mazen can lead any significant move or change in the Palestinian attitude towards an agreement with Israel. And unfortunately, I think that until he is not replaced, democratically, of course, by somebody else with the stature, with the willingness to change course with Israel, that will not happen. There are many in the West Bank, amongst the Palestinians, I'm sure in Gaza too, that see the futility of their negative, absolute negative attitude towards any agreement that Israel brought to the table until now. It is not Israel that is isolated, it is them that are isolated, and there is a call to change course, but they lack the leadership, and as you know, leadership in the end is very important. They don't have it.
Thank you to you, Arthur, for giving of your time and your talents once again. Regards to your dear family, and this is the conclusion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Arthur. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You're watching JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, expanding Jewish understanding.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.